Yeah, there's a few aspects to that. I think the first one would be the land on which it's sited. And so I think whether you're mana whenua or mātā waka, meaning that you whakapapa elsewhere but you're living in another tribal rohe, the land that sits underneath that whare and where you're situated is really important. And your relationship to it will be different depending on whether that's your ancestral land or whether it's land that you've come to find home later on. And we've had huge urbanisation as Māori, so many of us live outside our tribal rohe. But I think it's important to always acknowledge exactly where you are in the world and how those houses, how those dwellings relate to that community and relate to that place. Secondly, I think that if you look at the site itself, the way dwellings are configured on a site, it's really important that they can be configured in a way that supports intergenerational housing and supports, whānau living the way that they want to live in a more collective manner. And I do think that's true whether you're living on your own ancestral land or living elsewhere. I think then when you also come down to particularly the internal configuration, a lot of that is about the layout being fit for purpose in terms of Māori whānau dynamics and cultural realities. And why I put it that way is because, just to describe a scenario, you might have a situation where, the population of the house, the number of occupants, fluctuates depending on what's happening in the life of the whānau. It could be that, your nephew's coming down to do some study and he stays with you for 3 months. Or it could be that your daughter and her partner and young baby have to come and stay with you for a period of time. And so these cultural responsibilities and whānau dynamics means that you need to have appropriate flexibility to change to meet the needs of the whānau. Because most of our Māori people are renters and not homeowners, either in an individual or collective sense, it means that often we're living in housing that's really not fit for purpose for our families and for the kind of things that we wish to be doing inside of these houses, but we make do and we adapt. And so you hear about things like overcrowding, and sometimes it's 20 people in a 3-bedroom house, but probably that whānau actually wants to live like that. And that's the house that's not fit for purpose. It's the house that is too small, and it's the price point and lack of availability of a house that would meet their needs that's the issue, not the way the whānau are configuring themselves and choosing to live. I think it's fair to say that the cultural whānau configurations and norms that are underpinning the way that we configure our housing stock, and that comes down to our planning, plan provisions as well as our building code, and I've got many examples of that. But I would say that they're not particularly serving Pākehā well, let alone anybody else. And so I think that, for the most part, our housing isn't really culturally fit for purpose for anybody. Yeah, I would say, no, I don't know why I'm bringing this up, but it was in a book I read recently that I can't remember who the citation was, so I'm going to probably miscite it terribly. But I read something that was saying that there had been research done, and I think by anthropologists, really saying that although there's often this myth that structures and architectures and buildings emerged as a need for shelter, actually before that came things like temples and monuments and things that served a cultural or religious function, and that predated using structures, using architecture as shelter. And I don't know exactly what I'm trying to say with that, but I thought that was a really interesting challenge to our preconception around what buildings are for and why we started to erect them as human beings. But I'll pause with that sort of idea and progress to say that I do think in this day and age there's 2 things. One, absolutely believe that housing is a fundamental human right. And I do think that the commodification of housing in this country and elsewhere, but especially in this country, is antithetical to that. And so I think that if we go so far as to acknowledge that housing is a human right, then we actually need to see a commitment to decommodifying housing and taking more and more housing out of the market. And I think Kay touched on some really important points this morning in that regard. And then secondly, I think that it's important to acknowledge the relationship and the expectations that have been set up through Te Tiriti o Waitangi. So not only is it a human right for everybody, and there's international frameworks for that we adhere to, but also we have a specific responsibility under Te Tiriti o Waitangi to ensure that we've got, equality of opportunity and outcome. And I think that's not something that we're consistently seeing. And I think the work that's being done at the moment in terms of the Waitangi Tribunal inquiry into housing and some of the reports that are starting to be released have, unequivocally demonstrated that that's not being achieved. And so I think you're seeing that Māori housing outcomes are much worse overall, and that's only continued to worsen. And so at a minimum, under Te Tiriti o Waitangi, we've got a responsibility to bring the housing outcomes for Māori, for whānau Māori, on par with whānau Pākehā, who have much higher home ownership rates, much more secure housing, higher quality standard of housing. Across virtually every metric, New Zealand Europeans are doing better than Māori and actually everybody else. I remember at a previous community housing Aotearoa conference that the late Moana Jackson spoke of the idea of houselessness as opposed to homelessness. And I think that resonated with many who were in the room at that time, including myself, who was very fortunate to be there. And I think my comment on that would be, in relation to Māori, as tangata whenua of this place, of these motu, of this country, how could we ever be homeless? And so as our land base has been steadily eroded away, we're still here, even if we don't have control over the whenua in our rohe, or it's been whittled down to a very small amount. We're still here and we have certain responsibilities to this whenua that we carry and that we've inherited. And so I don't think under those conditions you could ever say that Māori are homeless, but certainly many of our people are kainga kore, are houseless, and that can be directly attributed to colonisation, to the loss of our land, to the urbanisation that occurred where we were encouraged or, supported or coerced or whatever may have happened. There was many things going on at the time, but we saw a huge urban shift. Our land base was eroded from the more rural areas and actually everywhere, and also others benefited from intergenerational wealth from our land that was taken or otherwise alienated from us. So it's no shock to see, unfortunately, it's not surprising to see how many of our kainga tangata, kainga kore, are Māori, but could we call them homeless? I don't think that's the right term. Yeah, I guess I think I'll start by prefacing that I think the community housing sector is maturing, but I think there's still some serious limitations, and I think that's more down to the government policy settings than down to the providers themselves. It was interesting to hear some of the comments this morning, particularly from Victoria Carroll, who was saying, well, when I've come to these in this past, these conferences are pretty white. And she was just being honest. And then she followed on with saying, but it's great to see how much this has shifted and to see the diversity in the room. And I felt encouraged by that too. I remember when I first sort of started being in this space, I did feel like it was very Pākehā dominated and all wonderful, well-meaning people who really care about the kaupapa, but it does something or it distorts the conversation when you don't have the balance of demographics right. And it's the same with our elected representatives. When they don't represent the communities they serve, that's a problem. And I think that's true for those of us who are working in the community housing space if we don't appropriately reflect the demographics of those communities that we're working with and that we serve. Which is all to say that I think the role of community housing, and Kay Saville-Smith put forward some good provocations this morning, but I think the role of community housing really is to be these insiders who really know and understand the communities they work with, and they're able to tailor their approaches to be fit for purpose for those communities that they're working with. And I think they also have the social imperatives and the commitments to placemaking and forming strong community and facilitating great communities outcomes and being there all the way along. So they're not kind of just develop something and then be like, okay, well, over to you, best of luck. We're members of the community, we're committed to this community, and we're working together to both shape what it needs to be and how it looks and continues on into the future. So it's that sustained commitment and that deep knowledge and knowing of that specific community that I think differentiates community housing providers from others such as Kāinga Ora and also the private sector. I will say that this current government, I think, has, perhaps it wouldn't seem quiet to those who are here at this conference because they follow policy and they read cabinet papers, but I do think that they've been, as far as the general public is concerned, quietly making some very significant structural change. And I guess I know this because I'm one of those nerds that will read the cabinet paper and analyse what it means and has followed that over time. And then I'll talk to others who don't work in the sector and don't work in this space. And often they have no idea about some of the more radical reforms that have been brought into place. And I think we're starting to see the fruits of that approach. And so I do feel optimistic. I do want to acknowledge what Kay Saville-Smith had to say this morning, which is really, we've been on a steady trajectory in terms of a broken housing system. And there's lots of data and clear analysis to kind of back that up. But her message of hope really was that it's going to get worse before it gets better, but it is going to get better. And that's what I really took from that kōrero, and what I've taken from reading writings of people like Kay and others, and seeing the data and doing my own policy analysis as well over the years. I do think that there's been some structural level reform, and we will continue to see that moving forward. So there's reason to feel optimistic. I think that we have a pretty positive situation in New Zealand where even our right-wing political parties are pretty centrist by the standards of other countries. And so I think, yes, there might be some neoliberal reforms if we do see a change of government. But I think a lot of the changes that have been made are pretty hard baked in, hard to repeal. And in fact, a lot of them have support from the centre-right as well. So I don't think it's the catastrophe people are worrying about necessarily. I do think there might be some steps backwards or some changes. But overall, I think the trajectory will remain positive.